What happens when you find yourself trapped in an alpine thunderstorm and you realise you've made the one vital mistake that could quickly ruin your entire road trip? Well, on day 10 of our car camping road trip across Europe, we were about to discover the answer to this question, and it wasn't what we expected.
There's a peg on our roof.
What peg?
A peg. A metal peg. There's a metal peg on our roof.
Where's it came from?
I have no idea. Right here.
A big one. I don't know if you remember that storm the other day that we went through. We thought the only damage was really to the table that got broken, but check this out. That is the crack on the glass. So in this video I'm going to reveal the exact mistake we made, how we ultimately suffered the consequences of it, and what we should have done instead, so you never have to worry about making the same schoolboy error. But before we find out what this simple mistake was, just how close did we really get to having our first ever road trip completely and utterly ruined? And the scary part is, it almost got as close as you can get. Because of one foolish mistake, we were hit with a $2,000 repair bill, and that wasn't even the worst of it. We both experienced mental trauma from the incident, and it all happened unexpectedly in a matter of minutes. But looking back now, we should have seen it coming well before it was too late. At the time of the incident, we felt completely powerless. And afterwards, we were beginning to question whether it was even safe for us to continue camping for the rest of the trip. But the stakes were high, because not only were we now looking out for our own well-being, something we should have been doing from the get-go, we also hadn't budgeted for staying in hotels or apartments for the rest of the trip. Camping was saving us a lot of money, and up to this point, we were absolutely loving the camping way of life. Had we not made this one easily avoidable mistake, we wouldn't have been second guessing our route to head further into the Alps, and would have saved ourselves a ton of stress when we found ourselves in even more stormy conditions later on in the trip. Super heavy rain, as you can hear just now, coming down. Pretty violent thunderstorm rolling over us. Just keeping an eye on things just now, just making sure there's no water coming in, and hopefully this passes soon. And to help you understand just how lucky we were that this mistake didn't ultimately ruin our road trip, I need to take you back to that fateful day, our 10th day on the road as we car camped across Europe for our honeymoon. Up to this point, our journey had been a breeze, aside from the exhaustion of non-stop travelling, but little did we know, everything was about to change. The day began like any other day of our road trip. We woke up in our Tesla and took a moment to appreciate the view as we looked out across the Bavarian Alpine mountain range. The weather was as good as it gets. Blue skies, full sunshine, and a slight breeze in the air. We took the opportunity to set up one of the awnings on our car tent, and if you didn't already know, this road trip was not only our first time sleeping in the car, it was also our first time camping. So we spent some time learning how to tie alpine knots so we could set up and tie down the poles that held up the awning section of our tent. And this is where in hindsight it's blindingly obvious, at least to the semi-trained camper, that there's something vitally important missing from our setup. But we'll get into this in more detail later in the video. We strolled down to the campsite reception to pay for another night's stay and to see if we could hire some e-bikes to go to the nearest town. But the only e-bikes available were for families and children, so we scrapped those plans and decided to go for a walk around the lake instead. We discovered some fish enjoying the summer sun, and it was refreshing to have a day with no set plans and no extra travelling, as this would be the first campsite we would stay at for more than one night. And looking out over the lake, we couldn't take our eyes off the Alpine mountain range in the distance, which is the direction we would be driving towards on our next travel day. And it was at this point that we decided we would try and rent some paddle boards, or at the very least go for a swim in the lake. We're currently walking on a dam. This is amazing. That's the big lake, and then this is the little one. We might rent some paddle boards. If not, we'll definitely be taking a dip in the lake. Yeah, what a place. What a place it is. We're very lucky. Luckily, we were able to rent some paddle boards from the campsite, and we were glad to see some clouds rolling over the mountains for our first time paddleboarding. because up to this point we had been boiling in the baking hot sun, so we welcomed the cooler conditions as we set out onto the lake. But it didn't take long for the weather to change once again, as we heard that all too familiar rumble of thunder in the distance and the clouds began to roll over the mountain. A thunderstorm was coming, and looking back, we should have taken this more seriously. Most of the people who were enjoying the lake had left, and we should have realised that paddleboarding during a thunderstorm next to the Alps probably wasn't the smartest decision we could have made. But we thought it was a pretty cool experience, and we only had 30 minutes of our rental time left, so just how bad could it get? Whoa! Holy moly. No, you're fine, it's over there, it's moving that way. You're fine, you're okay, you're alright. It's getting quite bad. It was then that we realised the conditions were going to get a lot worse. So to save time, we split up. Rebecca went back to take down the awning and set up her table and stove for dinner, and I headed back to reception, paddleboard in hand as the rain started to drizzle, then pour, till it finally began to drench as I sprinted towards reception. And I say sprinted loosely because if you've ever had to carry a paddleboard over any great distance, you'll know just how awkward those things are. By the time I'd gotten back to the tent, we were beginning to realise just why everyone else had fled the lake before us. The rain wasn't stopping, but that was the least of our worries, because we were about to quickly find out the real danger of camping in the wild, and how one simple mistake was about to risk ruining our entire road trip plans from this point onwards. Like slowly turning up a dial without stopping, the wind started to blow from the west, hitting our tent side on. In fact, hitting us at the very side Rebecca had set up our table and stove. This was the first time in our 10-day journey we'd experienced strong winds, and let me remind you, this was also our first time camping, and it was at this point that fear started to take over. Because we quickly realised that while we'd spent days and weeks researching where to go on our trip, what equipment we needed to buy, which campsites we could potentially visit, and the locations and restaurants we wanted to see along the way, there was one vitally important thing we'd forgotten. We made the mistake of not learning how to properly set up our tent, not even before we left for our trip, but also during the 10 days where we had the opportunity to do so in calm conditions. If you look at our previous tent setups, can you see what's missing? Is there anything we may have overlooked? If you know a thing or two about camping, it's stupidly obvious. But to us newbie campers, we had no idea just how important guy lines are. And as we would soon learn, no matter how calm the weather is, no matter what, always set up your guy lines first. But by now, it was too late. There was nothing we could do but hold on to our tent from the inside and pray it wouldn't be swept away. And the wind just kept getting stronger and stronger. We were both holding on to the one side of the tent that was getting hit the hardest. Time began to slow as the adrenaline started coursing through our veins. We looked around at all of our belongings and equipment which lay inside the tent just waiting to be destroyed. And I started to think about what we would need to do if the wind began to blow any harder. It was too late to worry about our kit. It was time to focus on our own safety. So I shouted to Rebecca, who was right next to me, over the wind as it violently buffeted the tent. I shouted, "You need to get inside the car. Get inside the car now." And I'm not dramatising the following events. This is exactly as it happened. Had we not been hit by the storm so quickly, we would have footage of these exact moments. But as you can imagine, our focus was now locked in on ensuring we were going to survive the consequences of our dangerous mistake. Like something from a movie, she shouted back, "I'm not leaving you." But I knew things were about to turn south, and this felt like a life or death moment. So I just screamed at her, "Go, go, go," as she let go of the corner of the tent and managed to sprint into the back of the car through the open boot. A massive gust of wind crashed into the side of the tent and sent our camping table and stove flying. And I'll never forget this, but at this moment, all I could think of was, well, that's our dinner done for. It was at this point, as I was clinging onto the corner of the tent, I decided it wasn't worth saving. What else could come crashing into the tent from outside? And did I really want to be here when it did? So I let go of the tent and scrambled over the upturned table, somehow making it inside the car. Finally, we were safe. But by now, the tent had completely collapsed. And from inside the back of the car, I was clinging onto what little material I could, in hopes that our tent wouldn't be ripped away from us entirely. The rain began to flood inside the tent and soaked every piece of equipment and belongings we had left behind. And to make matters worse, we then realised rain was pouring inside the car through every single window. Because in the chaos of the storm, Rebecca had accidentally tapped a button on the app for our car. You see, the Tesla has a vent function where you can tap the button and all of the windows roll down an inch or so automatically. This is normally useful on a hot day, so you can release hot air from the car without having to run the air conditioning. It is not, however, supposed to be used during a torrential downpour and thunderstorm. But as our luck was changing for the worse that day, Rebecca had accidentally tapped the button. Now, all of our bedding, our camping mattress, our pillows, everything was completely soaked. And if this was the icing on the cake, we were about to discover the cherry on top. Almost quite literally. As you can see in this scene, as the storm started to slow down, we discovered something on the glass roof of our car which made our stomachs churn.
Yeah.
So I guess this is the reality of camping. Obviously we've never done it before. I don't know if this is normal or if this is a freak accident, but we were just paddleboarding out in the lake.
There's a peg on our roof.
What peg?
A peg. A metal peg. There's a metal peg on our
Where's
roof.
it came from?
I have no idea. Right here.
A big one?
Not only had we been traumatised by the events that unfolded, damaged our equipment, soaked our bedding, began to doubt our route to head further into the Alps, and even question whether we were cut out for camping for good, we now realise the most expensive and dangerous consequence of our foolish mistake. The storm was so strong, it ripped one of our camping pegs from the ground, flew through the air, and smashed the glass roof of our car. It was only when we arrived in the city of Innsbruck days later that we discovered the impact site and the massive crack along our glass roof. This resulted in a $2,000 repair bill when we got home, because the crack in the glass was so long that it was beyond repair and the entire glass roof needed to be replaced. And we were lucky that this didn't end our road trip in an instant, because if the steel peg had cracked the interior of the glass roof, it wouldn't have been safe for us to continue. But the most gut-wrenching part of it all was the thought of what would have happened if the peg hadn't hit the glass roof. What if it had hit us or someone else? What damage could that have caused, and how could we live with the consequences of it? This entire scenario could have been prevented, but before we look into what we could have done to avoid all of this, let's quickly examine why our road trip was almost ruined by this one mistake. Not only did we have an expensive repair waiting for us when we got home and could have injured ourselves or worse, we were now left with the mental trauma of this experience, something that wouldn't leave us for the rest of the trip. There's no more footage of this day after the storm passed, because we spent the next 4 hours cleaning up, learning how to actually use and set up guy lines by our kind Dutch neighbours, and drying every single inch of our mattress, bedding and pillows. Somehow our camping stove had miraculously survived, and as we cooked dinner in the pitch black at 10 PM, we began to doubt if we should dare to continue this trip. Even though we hadn't said so to each other directly, deep down we both knew we were having the same doubts. Our route was going to take us even deeper into the Alpine mountain range, and we began to fear the unpredictable weather we would most likely face. After the Alps, we were due to head to Lake Como in Italy, and the weather wasn't looking too promising there either. If we were to continue on this trip, was it even safe for us to keep camping? Even with the knowledge and understanding of how important the guy lines were, and if it was still safe to do so, were we mentally strong enough to push through and ignore the stress of the stormy conditions we were bound to find ourselves in? All of a sudden, this magical idea to go on a road trip and camp for the first time across Europe for our honeymoon was being turned upside down by the sheer reality of it all. Our worries weren't put at ease when the fire brigade turned up with large canopies to house families whose tents had been destroyed by the storm. And the next morning, when I walked to the bins at the campsite, they were littered with broken tents and gazebos. Many of the people we had met at this campsite were either forced to leave or were considering changing their plans entirely. We couldn't change what had happened. We'd made the mistake and were paying the price. All we could focus on was what we were going to do next. But we were determined to learn from our mistake and not let this ruin what had been the best trip of our lives up to this point. So what exactly could we have done differently to avoid all of the stress and drama we'd experienced? How could you learn from our mistakes and help yourself or someone you know avoid any potential trauma before setting off for their first road trip or camping adventure? Well, to answer that question, we first need to look at why we neglected to do the very thing we should have done all along. This trip was an idea we'd been thinking about for years. One of those fantasies where you ask yourself, what would it be like if we did something completely different? Something totally out of our comfort zone. So when the opportunity presented itself, we jumped at it as fast as we could. We only had a few weeks to turn this idea into a solid plan of action. And like any road trip, it started with mapping out the route. We took note of the key destinations we wanted to visit and connected the dots to find the most exciting route to tie it all together. So now we had a sense of direction. The next task was to figure out how we were going to pull it all off. As first time campers, we had very little that we could already use, so we had to research all of the kit we would need, and in all honesty, we completely overbought for this trip because we were planning for the worst case scenario. Which is ironic because we forgot to do the one thing any new camper should do. We forgot to focus on how we were going to keep ourselves safe. One of the reasons we neglected to do so was because we were going to be sleeping in our car. So by the very nature of our sleeping arrangement, we were going to be safe, because what can really go wrong in a stationary car at a campsite? The tent was a luxury, not a necessity. It would be our extra living space, an area to get dressed, have some shelter from the elements, and stretch our legs on any rainy days. We did a quick setup in our garden before we left to make sure that your tent actually worked. And up to this point in the trip, we'd simply been pegging down the base of the tent and using the guy lines to tie some of the awnings down by attaching them to the wheels of the car. But we never took the time to learn how to actually use the guy lines. They were just loosely wrapped around the wheels with a half hitch knot. And we only did this with the lines that were attached to the awnings of the tent. The guy lines that were attached to the air columns, which actually provide the structure for the tent, were left completely untouched. Little did we know we were sitting on a ticking time bomb, and the only reason our tent hadn't collapsed on us so far was because we were lucky enough to have been camping in calm conditions. We should have seen this coming well before it was too late, because on the previous day, as we drove from the German town of Bamberg down towards the Bavarian Alps, the weather conditions were becoming more unstable. We swapped sunny Bamberg for thundery conditions as we arrived at the campsite, and not too long after we'd arrived, the weather reverted to a calm, cool evening, allowing us to set up our tent and enjoy the views across the lake. We were close to the Alps, and this should have sent alarm bells ringing to double check our setup, since the chances of us finding ourselves in more extreme conditions were now much higher. And it's not like we couldn't have spent the time to do so, because on the morning of day 10, we'd learned a new skill. A simple YouTube video taught us in 10 minutes how to tie alpine knots, so we could set up one of the awnings on our tent for the first time. We were so close to dialing in our tent setup and ensuring it was ready to brave the ever-changing alpine weather patterns. And we should have taken note from all of the campers we were surrounded by. Just by briefly looking at their setups, we could tell they were experienced. Everything was neat, orderly and secure, and we weren't quite to this standard just yet. Soon, however, we would be forced to learn the hard way. And so the main reason we didn't take the time to learn how to use our tent properly was a matter of personal pride. Stupidly, I felt intimidated by it all. We were the newbie campers, a bunch of fish flapping out of water. I knew I didn't really know what I was doing, but I didn't want the rest of the campers around us to know. And the tent had been fine so far, so what could really go wrong? Rather than ask some of our camping neighbours for help or their thoughts on our setup, rather than take the time to watch some videos on the basic fundamentals of setting up a tent, I chose to ignore the house of cards we were living in and instead focused on enjoying this new experience that we were fully immersed in. And in all honesty, looking back, I can't exactly be so hard on myself because we'd been having the time of our lives. It was all completely new, exciting and overwhelming. And while it sounds so simple from an outside perspective, it was an easy but extremely dangerous mistake to make. But it was one that could have ended much worse than it did, and we were lucky to walk away with the scars we'd inflicted upon ourselves. All we had to do to prevent the trauma we'd experienced, to ensure that those around us were safe, was to ask for a little help. If we had simply prioritised safety above all and took the basic steps to understand how to use our equipment, all of this could have been avoided. So I hope that this video serves as an important lesson. No matter what, if you or someone you know is embarking on a road trip, even if they've done it 1,000,000 times over, don't forget the importance of prioritising safety first. It doesn't matter how excited you are to just go, or how embarrassed or proud you are to ask for some help. Your well-being and the safety of those around you is the highest priority. And we thought this learning experience was so important, we actually filmed ourselves showing you how to set up one of these tents and how to properly use guy lines when we next set up camp the following day near the city of Innsbruck in Austria. As you can see, our Dutch neighbours showed us the fundamentals, which helped us discover how our setup should have looked all along. Not only did we now know how to correctly use our kit, this basic knowledge gave us a ton of confidence, and we were going to need it because, as we'd predicted, driving deeper into the Alpine mountains would bring more stormy days and nights. Little by little, we were learning the ropes and understanding how to keep ourselves safe. We knew when a storm was coming just by listening out for the sound of our fellow campers clanging away at their pegs in unison as they hammered them deep into the ground to prevent any pegs from flying through the air. And we made sure to follow suit because we couldn't afford to have our glass roof damaged once more, because that could have been the final blow that would send us home early without finishing what we'd set out to accomplish. And after having survived the Bavarian thunderstorm, we were determined to keep on going. So now you know the one mistake that nearly ruined our entire road trip, but how can you follow our story from the very beginning? We've documented every single day of our European car camping road trip, so you can experience all of the highs and lows without having to risk it all yourself. Click here to watch day 1 of our adventure, where we drive 10 hours in a single day as we attempt to reach our first campsite before nightfall. As always, thanks for watching, we'll see you in the next one.